Maeve Brennan after that, and Maeve is an artist who lives between London and Beirut. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here, and she's done some really very, very interesting projects in Beirut, has worked with Ashkal Alwan and many other projects. And then Tamara Chalabi, welcome. I've got to know Tamara for quite some time now. She's been doing this incredible work with the Ruya Foundation, the Iraq Pavilion at the Venice Biennale that I was very privileged to be involved with the work particularly of Sadiq al-Fraji. So for those of you who haven't been to Venice, please get on a plane and just go and see all the marvels of Venice, but also the Iraq Pavilion. And then absolutely last but not least, Zahrah al-Ghamdi. And I don't know how you're still standing, Zahrah, because Zahrah has been in the British Museum since about 8:30 this morning, creating this absolutely breathtaking installation on the ground of the Great Court in front of the old reading room. And I truly wish that we could have this work here for the foreseeable future. But if you haven't seen it, please make sure that you all go and see it. So without more ado, I will welcome our first speaker, Larissa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Venetia, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you for Shabak for inviting me to speak today and to the many events that you're having this year. My work is very much based on my own experience and my own biography. As I was introduced, I was born in Jerusalem. And I grew up in Bethlehem. I had to leave Palestine when I was about 15 because of the start of the Intifada in 1988. So I've been living outside of Palestine for the better half of my life. My Palestinian identity is always with me, because I think what is maybe hard to understand is that if you have a restriction on travel, and your identity determines what you are and where you can be, then it's very hard to kind of disassociate yourself from that region, even if all your existence is about something else. I think that's maybe part of my fascination for what is Palestinian identity. And the more I think of it, and the more I do work about Palestine, the more I realize that it's very much about, it has a lot to do with the resistance and our understanding of projecting a nation, for a future nation. And it also has a lot to do with our trauma of 1948 of Palestinians being kicked out from their own homes in 1948 and not being allowed to return. So it's kind of a very strange identity that follows any Palestinian, I can say, is this limbo where you're living in a trauma. So you have a psychological trauma that you're trying to deal with, but that's informing who you are as a people, because you're kind of constantly rooted in the past. You're thinking about 1948 but still projecting a future state. So the Palestinian identity, the best I could describe it would be is in a state of a limbo. And that kind of made me realize that it's very hard to talk about it in kind of a purely documentary form. And I think I started off by working in kind of pure, or not pure, but just my work was more about documenting what's really there and what's kind of being erased in Palestine, and trying to preserve memories of the place. But I started realizing that the more I talk about the horrors of what's going on in present-day Palestine, the less believable I have started. People didn't believe what I was saying. People couldn't believe that what I'm describing are happening in, one of what people describe Israel as one of the only democracies in the Middle East, and people could not understand that there could be such violations of human rights happening in the 21st century. So I felt that speaking about what's happening in more surreal terms, or resorting to fiction and finding my own universe, a parallel universe by which I can speak about it, is actually much more maybe productive, or much more honest to maybe the different layers and the different problematics of talking about the Middle East. So this is a still that you're seeing now from a film I made in 2009 called Space Exodus. And it depicts the first Palestinian astronaut, who's a woman, landing on the moon. And it's a comment on colonialism and land grab, and how do we really, what is this, the race for land grab? Is it just because you plant your flag there that, and you're first to go there, that you call it your own? And for a Palestinian, this is particularly kind of potent, because since I was born in Jerusalem, but I'm not allowed to enter Israel now. I think for the last 10 years or more, I haven't set foot in Jerusalem. And a lot of Palestinians say it's easier to reach the moon than it is to get to Jerusalem, because you don't get really visas or passes to go into Israel, because now even East Jerusalem is annexed to Israel. So you have to have a visa in order to go into Jerusalem. And it's very hard to get those visas unless you have a severe medical problem or other extreme cases. So in this work, obviously, there you see the Palestinian flag, and it's not that I'm very kind of tied to the concept or like introducing flags or even constantly saying the word Palestine, but it's kind of impossible to talk about the Palestinian problem without resorting to these symbolism. So it's symbolism and how we kind of identify with them and how they have become signifiers of who we are, and our identity as Palestinians are just very hard to escape. So in my work, I play around a lot with these concepts. So you see me here in my spaceship trying to establish contact with Jerusalem. And you see the Palestinian flag again. And the idea here is to kind of recontextualize these symbols that we always associate with Palestinians, but in a completely different form, where a form that where you start seeing those symbols in a different way, where they stop being like dead symbols, but they kind of have a meaning of their own. On the other side of my costume, there's, you can see on the sleeve Palestinian embroidery, which always comes up as something that is erased from Palestinians. It's a dying form of art. And here are my boots, which is kind of my nod to feminism and to the fact that I'm from the Middle East, so I had to find a twist on this. But eventually, I tried to establish contact with Jerusalem on my spaceship, but I never can speak to Jerusalem, so the contact is lost. I don't know if probably people know this poster, but you can see it in a lot of Palestinian homes, but actually it's not Palestinian. I think it's it was made in 1936. And it's a Zionist poster. It was a Zionist tourist agency that was trying to attract a lot of Jewish people for immigrating to Palestine to establish an Israeli state. So it's very funny to see how still in that, in 1936, obviously it says visit Palestine, because Palestine was under British rule. And about 80 years later, I kind of thought of, it's interesting to incorporate this very image and make a work around it. And you can see that instead of the Dome of the Rock, it's actually a Palestinian estate, which is like in my imagination, the biggest skyscraper in the world. And it's directly informed by how Israeli settlements are closing in on Palestinian cities, and there's hardly any room anymore. If you think about a viable Palestinian state, it's very hard to think of it as anything but a land with different pockets, different holes, and so horizontally speaking, it's very hard to understand how a viable Palestinian state would look like. So this is an ironic take on the idea of a Palestinian state, where actually the skyscraper is supposed to house the entire Palestinian population from all over the world, and it kind of addresses the Palestinian right of return. It talks about Palestinians in Palestine itself. And in the building itself, you see various floors representing different Palestinian cities, like Jerusalem on the 3rd, Bethlehem on the 4th, and so on. And obviously, it's an ironic take on the whole situation. That it's just the situation is so desperate that you really can think of it in those terms. I find it funny that one time when I was presenting my work, this particular work in Germany, somebody came to me and said, well, this is a very good solution for the conflict. So, so I think, whatever you think, please don't think of it as a solution to the... So you see the lobby kind of shows all the different floors of the building. And this is the Jerusalem floor. The lobby also incorporates this star that's usually seen in a lot of Palestinian embroidery, so again, kind of activating those symbols. And here you see a Man Express, and as people know, that it's very hard for Palestinians to go in and out of Palestine. I'm not, for example, because I'm from the West Bank, I'm not allowed to enter the Israeli airport. So I have to do this really convoluted trip around, and which is very costly and takes a lot of time. So in this building, it's really extremely convenient, and you can go by this express line that takes you from Amman to Jerusalem in 15 minutes. And as I said, I grew up in Bethlehem, so this is this is the manger square, and it's the floor where you see me finally coming to my own flat. So it's a manger square, but it's a bit more sci-fi because it's kind of in this futuristic building. And here again, the symbolism of the key and the right of return is used again. So the symbolism in this film is over the top, but that's for a very particular reason. And the olive tree as well. And they're all kind of appear like artifacts in this museum-like building, this pristine, almost clinical building. That's almost, you don't see many people in the building that house these objects that we all talk about when we talk about Palestinianhood. And I finally go to my flat and I eat out of porcelain plates that have the keffiyeh symbol again. But keffiyeh is, the biggest maybe Palestinian symbol for resistance. So based on this, I decided to I threw a sci-fi Palestinian dinner at the Delfina Foundation, where people ate from these porcelain plates. But then I started kind of dreaming about these plates and why is it that I constantly, even if I don't want to, I myself am lumping myself with these symbols. And I decided to make a production line to make more plates. And then I thought that the final gesture for me was to find a way of really using these symbols and reactivating them in a proper way. And I thought that if it didn't work out to actually go to the moon, it's better maybe to use up the land itself and actually go to Palestine and Israel and bury these plates to finally have evidence or proof that Palestinian people exist. So this is a film that I made in 2015, and it's based on a rebel group that call themselves narrative terrorists. And what they want to do is kind of change the course of history. So what they're doing here is that they're planting these porcelain plates that kind of function like Palestinian DNA plates in front of all the colonial powers that the Palestinian people have experienced. So you see the British mandate on the right, Ottomans in the middle, and Israelis on the left. But the film is a bit more nuanced as well, because I think when you speak about Palestine, it's very hard to speak about it in terms of the present alone. And I think that everything that we know about Palestine is also not only from lived experience as somebody who grew up there, but also from all the archival footage and a lot of it got erased as well. But I got fascinated by this image of two girls from 19th century and they're called two Bethlehem girls. And I thought this image is so haunting. It was almost reminds me of those two girls in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. And I thought the horror of it, and I'm fascinated by Kubrick, and I always kind of refer to his work in my work. And I thought that whenever you look at archives, it's very hard to not put yourself in there. It's the minute you look at an archive, you already classify it, so you are already intervening with that history. And for me, it was difficult to talk about my own Palestinian kind of trauma without talking about the collective trauma. So I had to make it into a personal and collective kind of remembrance of our history in the film. I think I don't know if I have time, but I would like to show it. 1 more minute. So I'd like to show maybe a clip from the film.
ليش اخترتي علم الآثار كساحة المعركة؟
هاي كانت واحدة من الجبهات من الأساس اللي حكمونا بنى هويتهم معتمدين على الآثار. ما عاد في لزوم للتاريخ. ها هي أداة التعريف اللي اختاروها عشان يخلقوا وهم متجانس. Maybe I should stop here. وظيفة علم الآثار هي إنه يفسر الماضي. Sorry, because we don't have, I talk too much, but so in the film you see these bombs being thrown all over Israel and Palestine. They have porcelain inside them, and the fact that they're shaped as bombs, they kind of like a representation of how archaeology could be instrumentalized, and that's very much at the core of the film. Later, I did work on a performance where I actually did go to Palestine and Israel and buried these porcelain plates in various 15 locations there. And here you see the bombs actually exhibited at the mosaic rooms. And they have discs that hold the coordinates of all these digs or burials of the porcelain. Yeah, okay, that's it, I think.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Larissa. That was really, really amazing. I'm Maeve Brennan. I'm an artist based between Beirut and London. I'm going to talk predominantly about one film today, but I now feel like I have to reference this previous film after your talk, Larissa, which was kind of the reason I ended up moving to Lebanon in 2013. The previous film was a film kind of to do with my great-grandfather. His name was Ernest Richmond, and he was an architect invited to Jerusalem by the British Mandate government, and also ended up in charge of the Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem, which is now known as the Rockefeller Museum. So there is like a kind of strong historical connection that leads to Larissa's talk. But interestingly, Ernest Richmond was in fact a very pro-Palestinian, and inside the government kind of tried to reroute certain things. And his first piece of work was, he was in charge of restoring the Dome of the Rock, so he did a kind of architectural survey of that building. And in his survey, which is mainly kind of very objective architectural descriptions of the space, in fact, the introduction was quite politicized, and he talked about the kind of the sustaining of that building over those 14 centuries and the human efforts that had taken place in keeping that building alive as a kind of political act and defiance. And as long as that building remained intact, that kind of related to the Palestinian struggle in the face of kind of an Israeli offensive that attempts to destroy kind of cultural heritage in Palestine. So the film looked at that and his kind of interest in repair and restoration as a kind of possibly political act, and related that to the stone industry more generally in Palestine. So I interviewed an architect who had followed on from Ernest's work. He had been the resident architect at the Dome of the Rock for 32 years. I'm sorry, I have no images for this because I didn't know I was going to talk about it so much. So I spoke to him, Issam Awad, a geologist, an archaeologist, and a stone worker. And through those kind of contemporary interviews, I tried to understand the importance of stone in Palestine and the way it's kind of constructed. All the villages, everything was made of stone, and how that kind of connected to the Dome of the Rock and this kind of like central figure of the stone inside the shrine. So moving on to the contemporary film, that's kind of just giving you a bit of background as to why I first went to the region as well and ended up being in Palestine in 2013. And that led me to move to Lebanon to study at Ashkal Alwan as a fellow. And so I just completed a film in April, which is called The Drift, and it kind of continued these ideas in terms of looking at repair and restoration and the kind of importance of that in a place where things are at risk of being destroyed, history is at risk of being displaced. So with The Drift, the core of the film is looking at the Bekaa Valley. So most of the sites that I film at are in the Bekaa Valley, which is on the eastern flank of Lebanon and borders Syria. And I was interested in this region specifically because it has a kind of very rich archaeological history. It's where most of the convoys would travel through into the rest of the Middle East and into North Africa. So there's kind of a huge number of temples, kind of like a colossal number of temples that it's almost impossible to keep kind of repaired and restored. My good friend in Beirut was an archaeologist, and she had told me that there was a string of temples along the eastern flank of the Bekaa Valley that were not very well visited or documented, and each temple had a gatekeeper, so a guardian. And that kind of spoke to this. Obviously, everyone knows about the destruction of Palmyra in Syria and the kind of proximity of that to this part of Lebanon, which is on the eastern side. And of course, the murder of Khaled al-Assad, who was the protector of Palmyra. And I went to the Bekaa Valley to look at these temples, and I ended up meeting Fakhri, who is the first character that you'll see. I'm going to show a short trailer, which is just to give you an idea of the film so that you have something to visualize while I talk about this. Okay.
ايه مصمصة عامة
عم تشيل ياخذ سيجارة يولع عليه على الكاميرا ولا بتاع.
تعرفي كل حجر وين محل وين محل له الحجار إلا لا يكون هو مشتغل بإيده يعني.
هيدا دارج هالفترة؟
إنه هذا خرج سيارات سباق. بكرة بنعملها طيارة للسيارة.
Okay, so the appearance of Mohammed might be a bit incongruous at the moment, but I'll explain him soon. So to return to Fakhri, so I met him when I went to the temples in the village of Niha. There are two main Roman temples there, which he has kind of protected since he was 17, and his father was the guardian there before him. And there's a particularly strong kind of connection to those sites. They're in the center of the village, which I found was often the case. They're not kind of distinct from local life. They're very much a part of everyday life. And Fakhri and the other gatekeepers would often use the sites partly as orchards. And so it was very much kind of like an alive kind of site. And Fakhri guarded the temples throughout the civil war as well. So this was a kind of very lonely task. And he obviously felt very intensely connected to the sites, having lived through those years alone in a small house. This is the Bekaa Valley, sorry. That's Fakhri. So basically, at some points, when he would discuss the sites, he would almost talk about the Romans as if they were his family, like he referred to them as his cousins. And there was this kind of particularly intensified relationship to history as this kind of like space that he operated within every day. And it was his kind of life's work to keep the temples safe from the threat of looting and theft, which was kind of rife specifically during the Civil War, but also is kind of occurring again more on the border of Lebanon towards Syria, where things are getting more unstable due to the Civil War. So he was very proud of this, obviously. And this is him with the Temple of Niha. And this is Husn Niha, which is further up on a hill, and is a really interesting site because you might see that the temple is very damaged. It also appears in the trailer, and this isn't actually due to kind of historical erosion or natural decay. It was bombed directly during the Civil War as it was occupied by the Syrian troops from 1977 to 1980. So there was this kind of reconnection between conflict and these kind of temples that were obviously built as kind of big markers of civilizations by the Romans. Muhammad, so basically when I went to make this film, I wanted to meet people that were working with forms of repair and restoration and kind of look at this rebuilding that is constantly going on. And I had spent quite a lot of time in the Bekaa Valley, and it's not only kind of full of Roman temples, but it's also known for having a lot of scrapyards and a culture of rebuilding cars. And I was interested in finding a young man who would be as good at rebuilding his car as Fakhri had been at rebuilding his temple, which I haven't gone into, but he was also involved in the restoration of that temple in the 1970s. So there's also a culture of joyriding in the Bekaa Valley, and I was interested in that kind of act. So the film is called The Drift, and drifting is this kind of controlled skid. And I was interested in that kind of horizontal trajectory that youth culture was taking on top of a kind of landscape that was deeply layered and full of all of these historic civilizations. And I found Muhammad when I was filming in one of these scrapyards, and he had a very different sense of history and the kind of what kind of stakes it had in his situation and for his generation, obviously, than Fakhri. Fakhri had lived through the Civil War and had kind of had this intense relationship to that conflict, and Muhammad was born just after. So Muhammad was very, very kind of charismatic character, and really kind of said these quite incredible things about history. And the kind of his relationship to the Romans was obviously very different to Fakhri's, and he said at some point, all they left me was bones and broken pottery. I swear I don't forgive them. So he's kind of like got this irreverence towards history as it's kind of not got any use value for him, and his kind of object of care is not the temple but the car, and the car offers him this agency to move around space and kind of he's on top of all that history. So he, at one interesting point, we went to visit a monument in Rattle, which is the town where he is from, which is known for dealing in stolen cars and also more recently in smuggled antiquities from Syria. And so we stopped at this monument, which is actually a kind of bombed out car, which was a monument to Ali Saleh, who was a Hezbollah leader, and his car was bombed by the Israeli government in 2003. And he kind of arrives at this destination because I was interested in kind of looking at his local monument in relation to Fakhri's. And he begins by telling you this story quite seriously, and then soon says, oh, but every time I drive by this car, I can't help but look at those wheels. They're brand new. Damn, someday I'm going to come and steal them. So it's kind of like this very kind of different intergenerational relationship to history that the film ended up kind of portraying, which was not my intention, but it was obviously just present in these stories. And the third character, Hashim, who was actually the kind of inspiration for the film. And I met him very early on when I first moved to Beirut, because he worked in the archaeology department at the American University. And he basically, he's from Syria, and he moved to Lebanon in the early 1990s after the civil war ended. And at that point, there were kind of huge digs going on in downtown Beirut because the whole of downtown Beirut had been really flattened during the civil war. And that kind of left space for these archaeological digs and this kind of rapid excavation period that brought up a lot of material. Beirut's one of the oldest inhabited cities in the world, so there's a lot of material to be dug up. And he basically is a self-taught archaeological conservator, and he has a basement office at the university filled with the material dug up from these digs, and over the past 25 years has been rebuilding these clay artifacts. So that kind of, to me, was an interesting analogy in terms of an attempt to kind of reconstruct things that are broken and understand historical narratives which might otherwise be lost. So I think basically the whole talk was meant to be based around this kind of threat to cultural heritage, and I think it's interesting to look at the kind of moments of repair and restoration and rebuilding that are going on, and that's what I hope I've spoken about.
I wanted to thank, the organizers, Shabak, and the sponsors for having me here and organizing this very interesting day. So as you can see, I'm going to be talking about the heritage of loss. It's, in this case, specific to the projects that I've been involved with in Iraq, but I would argue that it's a universal story. That, you know, this is one case study, but it's and it's really about the loss of a way of life that I want to propose, not just one historic monument or an ancient building. And I will start with this image, which is an image of a middle-class home in Baghdad in the late 50s of an architect, where you see very clear references to modernism, whether in the furniture. Sorry, I can see it here. In the furniture, in the artwork, the lamps, the chairs, and towards the back there is one artwork, which is a bronze relief called Pastoral, that is by Jawad Salim. Sorry. Anyway, what I'm going to be showing just at the beginning is kind of this way of life that I'm referring to from a cultural perspective that has been lost. So it has been, in fact, been degrading over many decades. So this didn't just start in 2003 with the U.S. Invasion of Iraq. This is a plan made by Frank Lloyd Wright of Greater Baghdad. He was invited along with Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, and several other major kind of cultural figures to design different projects for Baghdad. He was supposed to build an opera house, and this is one plan that he did. This is what Walter Gropius designed, one section of the Baghdad University. This is the University Mosque, and in fact, he ended up realizing this project, which got built. So Baghdad University today, you wouldn't believe it if you saw it, but it was actually built by Walter Gropius. Actually, everything is in decay. I'm showing this image, which is of a text, of a calligraphy, an Abbasid text, as you see, of an outdoor scene. There's figures, there's imagery. It's part of a medical text on something, I'm not sure, but produced in Baghdad, and to kind of like show the different elements of this kind of like cultural heritage that is not only, as I said, about monuments, but here we are, this is Babylon, an image of Babylon from 1927, if I remember. Of Ctesiphon, taken, these are American tourists in 1963, I think. And the photo is taken by someone we've worked with very closely at Ruya Foundation, Latif Al-Ani, who's probably documented the most interesting, or at least prolifically interesting images of not just Iraq, but of Iraq that are very valuable, we think. Moving on to, this is basically the state of decay, which is, I mean, again, decay can be, neglect, war, corruption, many things. It's not just purely about violence, but this used to be a room full of archives of records of files and reports from the Ministry of Culture. This picture I took last year, so this has kind of been going on for many, many years now. As this is the main storeroom of the what used to be called the Saddam Art Museum and is now part of the Ministry of Culture. Just kind of paintings shoved in a, I mean, there's kind of no setup, no structure, no way of dealing with all the things that we, especially when you're dealing with exhibitions, the pain of packing and storing and preserving. This is the courtyard in the Iraq Museum. These are old vitrines that were done by the Germans in the 60s. It's just sitting there. And then we come to a different kind of destruction, which is more obvious and blatant and violent to even look at. I think very difficult. This is one image of ISIS. So this is 2015, but we start with 2014, where they're destroying these monuments and these statues at the Mosul Museum. So going back 1 year in 2014, in August 3 to be specific, there was an onslaught of ISIS onto what's called Jabal Sinjar, the Sinjar Mountains, which is to the north. They're in the Kurdish region of Iraq, not far from the Syrian border, where there's a predominant Yazidi population, a minority religious group that has been almost annihilated by ISIS because they're non-believers. The women have been raped. I mean, the stories are endless. But we, as Ruya Foundation, reacted, wanted to, this had an impact in terms of kind of what we were trying to do on the ground. And anyway, you can find out about us. I'm not going to talk about Ruya Foundation, but we have a website and you can go and see what we do. But so these are, these people fleeing by the hundreds of thousands. I mean, within I think 3 months of ISIS taking over Mosul in June 2014, you had 1.8 million internally displaced people in Iraq, just to kind of talk of the scale. So we did the project, which was modest at the time, of like just going and working with refugees just by providing basic art material and asking them to just write, draw, do anything they want, but like as a way to be able to show the world directly, not through an intermediary or an interlocutor, just what people were feeling, wanted to say, their kind of emotional memory, if you like. So it's not just about the object of what they did, but what that represents. It was a very well received. We went to several camps, and the result of this was, these are some of the images, which interestingly mostly were about projections of pretty things and their homes and flowers and so on. But they're also about showing, it says Jabal Sinjar, Daesh killing a child and a woman, and so a lot of testimony. Then we went, I was working at the time for the last Iraq Pavilion in 2015 with called Invisible Beauty, but the curator was Philippe van Couteren, and we worked on this project. We sort of devised it together and decided that we needed to have an international endorsement. Sort of this is the flip side of what I think Khaled, the the artist from Syria was talking about this morning, how, you know, involving kind of international celebrities or having this like artistic tourism, there's a kind of a flip side to it of basically trying to engage with someone who has enough of a name recognition that the project gets attention, otherwise it probably doesn't. And so we actually went to Beijing because Ai Weiwei seemed like a very good example at the time of someone who was stuck under, he couldn't travel, he didn't have a passport, he was confined. And to kind of link up those things, and this kind of actually started his whole interest in the whole refugee thing, which now has resulted in a book. Anyway, we had a further collaboration, but we produced a book called Traces of Survival, Drawings of Refugees in Iraq, selected by Ai Weiwei, and this formed part of a side exhibition to this pavilion in 2015, and this book was sold. Proceeds went back to the refugees that participated in the book, and every single one who participated is in this book. But it's again about, you know, referring to this idea of the emotional memory of a country, of a people, where you're dealing with not just the object and the drawing, but you know, a way of life that is kind of being annihilated. Following this project, we continued to work in the camps. Directly with some of the inhabitants, but also through inviting another kind of international artist who was more engaged into coming and who could come, Francis Alice, and who wanted to work with children. He has a whole series called Children's Games, and again documenting that. And from that was one of the ideas that was integrated into the pavilion that I co-curated this year, the Iraq Pavilion in Venice, Archaic, with Paulo Colombo, of inviting Francis along with artists living both in Iraq and Iraqi artists in diaspora, as well as something very fundamental, which we've been talking about in different ways, archaeology. So worked with several people. This is in the Baghdad Museum, the museum that was looted in 2003, with a very important archaeologist, Dr. Lamia Gailani, who's holding a cylinder seal here. And essentially, this is the first time that anything comes out of this museum legally that goes out to a show since 1988. And just the process of bringing it to Venice is you know, worth a separate book. It was such an incredible ordeal. But the point is about, again, talking about just in the way that, you know, we're talking about Mesopotamia and the birth of civilization and so on, and how this becomes kind of universal heritage in a way that contemporary art may be more sectioned into, as we say, you know, people, you know, artists from Iraq or from Syria or from, I mean, when in fact, you know, it's effectively, these are the artifacts of the past that inform the present, but these contemporary works are going to be what's going to inform the future. I mean, this point was also made today, but so in specifically to do with the pavilion and the preparations for it, I'm just going to mention, I can't talk about all of the artists, but I'm going to mention a couple of artists. One is Nadine Haddem, she's based in Berlin at the moment. She's from the Mandean community in Iraq, which have almost, like, there's very few left. And they're, again, a minority, a religious group that's not Muslim, that's not Christian, that's kind of their own. And their worship is very connected to water. And they've always lived near water and have all their practices in water. So we commissioned Nadine to do work on water, which became a very biographical story for her, about her family's journey from Iraq through all these countries to Australia, and, you know, again, kind of documenting the whole notion of, you know, immigration, loss, yearning, nostalgia, family history, and her own identity. I mean, very, very kind of potent themes that we've all, you know, like, I mean, that are being touched upon here. Just specifically, this is the Pavilion in Venice, which, as Venetia said, you must all go and see. This is the piece of work by Jawad Salim from the first image I showed you, Pastoral, which had not been exhibited since that time in that house in Baghdad. And it felt very important to include in this exhibition on the archaic, reflecting both what is archaic in terms of the connection with this ancient past and everything that emanates from it in terms of themes such as, water, hunt, writing, music, the earth, agriculture, war, and the interconnection of all, but also with works that are very much kind of a connector between the past and the present. These are very key works of major artists from Iraq that have defined modern visual culture. But the show wasn't a historic show. That's wasn't the intention. But it was kind of like how to kind of be able to convey this very complex, complicated, multi-layered country, which is archaic. Also, we argue in its current setup in terms of on every level in terms of a fragile political entity, of the bureaucracy, of society, religion. I mean, it just goes all the way down. Just to show you how just kind of an image of how the archaeology, the artifacts were transported and, by diplomatic pouch, and literally were not going to come 5 days before the show. I mean, it was a very complicated story. Working with Francis Alice, who got basically the work that he did was very much about witnessing war firsthand, and the artist as witness. We worked with him. He got embedded with an army unit at the beginning of the war to liberate Mosul, and kind of this is the outcome of that experience of recording and attempting to kind of create that visual memory, but also from an international perspective, again, for the reason that it attracts attention. I'm just going to show you some images of the pavilion. This is the work of Sadiq Freji, Sakar, Suleiman from Suleimania. Francis's work, he did a film 4 minutes long of trying to paint this landscape, get the right colors. The catalog, which has all of these artists and also various international figures writing on them. So again, it's about this need that we feel is necessary. I mean, not a need, but like it's an important fact of always trying to connect outside of the let's say locale, in this case being Iraq. So having people who are internationally connected, write about these things and kind of have this interaction, which I think is part of, it's a really important effort in trying to deal with this notion of recording and preserving at some level. So otherwise it becomes what's also been, again, more of a parochial internal story. I mean, there are several publications that we've done at Ruya, but this is the last one, and I will end with this very last publication, which we just came out, of Latif Al-Ani's work, who's not related to this pavilion, but a photographer, as I mentioned, who stopped taking images in the 1970s, but documented Iraq and the Iraqi way of life, and from the 50s all the way to the 70s. And again, the need to have these different kinds of projects, and it's kind of, what I've tried to show is the way in which we've responded to some of these more kind of like pressing, direct issues of crisis in the moment, of how to respond to them creatively. And I think there's a greater need for that, because it's not just by deploring the latest, attack on the mosque in Mosul by the World Monument Fund that's going to just do anything. I mean, it has to be much more engaged on a direct level, and especially, I believe, with artists who are in a very fragile situation that just needs to be continuously addressed as we speak. In whatever they end up doing, it's not that they have to respond directly to the conflict in that moment by working on war necessarily, but it's that fragility that needs to be constantly supported, and the platforms for that are very, very few if you're not within the art market of the Art Basel world, etc. It's extremely challenging. But anyway, thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, British Museum and Mosaic Room and Shabak. And a special thank you for Faisal Tamir and Sarah Ali Rida and my husband. Today, I am Zahrah Al-Ghamdi. I am from Saudi Arabia. I studied visual art and design. I am going to speak about Echo of the Past. Echo of the Past is part from traditional domestic architecture from southwestern Saudi Arabia. Southwestern Saudi Arabia, this includes 4 areas: Al-Baha, Asir, Jizan, and Najran. Southwestern Saudi Arabia, a long area, and has some unique traditions and terms of cultural and artistic expressions. There are different building styles which are built with the mud or flat schist or stone. The outside walls and windows frames and doors are often decorative with the geometric patterns. We know a lot of artists and architects reviewed and wrote about traditional architecture in southwestern Saudi Arabia and focused in the light aspect of this architecture, like the design and unique building characteristic. I am grown in southwestern Saudi Arabia. I am grown in southwestern Saudi Arabia by surrounding traditional domestic architecture. I can remember the unique artistic decoration of the rooms which reflect the history and the broader cultural. In my work, I reach back the memory of these places, their personal association and whether cultural significance. By creating Echo of the Past, I pull this history into the contact with the contemporary situation, exploring to throw light upon the recent drastic movement in architecture away from traditional technique and material and resource. I use my memories of places related to my childhood, but also express my memories in the act of creation. I draw my idea, embodied memory through particular gestures. In my work, I reflect upon the several influences that have been assisting in the creation of the work. I explain how my own personal experience and understanding of the frontal structure of my childhood have been affected by dependent research into the geographical and social architecture. To develop my artwork, I discuss the impact upon my work of my predecessor and contemporary within Saudi contemporary arts and position my own work within the context of the wider movement. The main aim of my artwork, create a body of work, reflect the past of traditional domestic architecture and with particular emphasis on the poetics, mental, physical, and emotional place. For example, in my work Inanimate Village, I created the shape of the inanimate village by inhabitants who moved to modern architecture. This village suffered from fear and depression in all surrounding of modern architecture. The village has been lonely, looking for a way for life. These houses began to run and crush into the reality and die and become like cemeteries. My installations are not intended to copy this style, but to find parallel language to express my memory of the structure I described. For example, the glimpse of the past. In my piece, Glimpse of the Past, I would like to explain the situation of traditional domestic architecture from disappearance resulting from destruction and exchange with the contemporary architecture. I depend in the performing this piece on my feeling that linked with the situation of this architecture, so my feeling was filled of sad and heartache for disappearance of this architecture. In my work, Potential Traditional Domestic Architecture and Destruction and Life Cycle, I create a hybrid and largely abstract language of installation art. My emotional aims in this pieces too is both express and address my own feeling of apologize for the loss and replacement of place. I requested an exploration of alienation and isolation at the loss of the frontal form of this architecture. In my work, Inherits Traditional Domestic Architecture and Lonesome and the Deserted Village, I propose that place is more than just name or number as a street. It's actually construction of the life and identity. From 2015 to 2017, I have had many large-scale city-specific sculpture works. I use the different material from sand, cotton, fabric, and plaster and water. For example, cell of the earth and cinders and embers and moderate landscape. I presented the works in the exhibition under the key theme was of the memory of the landscape. The use of the place memory of my story was demonstrated the power of the place. In my work, The Labyrinth and Time, I reflect the history and heritage houses founded in Al-Balad from Jeddah, this tourist area. That changed through the time. The historic area has become a maze. Finally, I would like to conclude with my experiment outside my studio. This part focused on description of my experience of creative work. These experiments were based in working outside my studio, which I undertook in southwestern Saudi Arabia. In my experiments, I use my childhood memories. I found this memory of place to have strong impact of my works. Thank you so much for attention. Thank you.
So we'll start with a few questions. I have questions for all of you, actually. I've so enjoyed your talks, all so different, and yet the theme is very strong in what you're talking about. And then there'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience before we finish the day with Eckhart. Larissa, so interesting to look at your work with you like this, and you talked about how you haven't been able to go back to Jerusalem for some 10 years or so. How, as an artist separated from the source of your inspiration, as it were, can you talk about that? It's hard to imagine what that feels like.
I do go back to Bethlehem, but I just feel like I cannot go to Jerusalem, where it was, which really was kind of at the center of any person who was brought up in Bethlehem. Jerusalem functioned as the city, and then you kind of lived in the suburbs of that city. So after the wall was built, it separated families from one another. There are certain friends that now I have on the other side of the wall, so I can't really communicate with them or meet with them. Some people have their work on the other side of the wall, so they can't work. So it's really just a very dramatic and drastic change to how we understand that region historically. But I do go there often, but not as often as I would like to go, just because it's extremely hard to go through the Jordanian bridge and be reminded over and over again that you're a Palestinian, and therefore you are almost like a second. You're not really. You're a second-rate, human being. So the part of the humiliation that you kind of are used to get from the Israeli army is obviously a policy for Palestinians not to go back again. And so there's a lot of people who are trying to just stay because of that reason. But life is made extremely hard because you cannot make a living. Internet is not that great. So I find that I did try to go and actually move and live there for a specific reason, that I feel so responsible for actually transmitting or kind of showing what's really happening in that place, and that is so urgent. But I feel that actually I'm better off being somewhere else and communicating that with better facilities, better internet, better mobility. So I think that obviously informs how I work, and the fact that most of my audience is actually European and American, so I do understand the context in which they see the work.
So it was, I think it was said at the last panel, it's like a huge responsibility on you as an artist, actually, because by living here in London, as I believe you are here now, is that do you feel that the need to be communicating this, because this is the only way in which you can touch people, because clearly, the newspapers and all this endless amount of things that we get coming out of what's happening in Israel, Palestine. I mean, it doesn't seem to matter how awful it is, it doesn't seem to have any impact whatsoever on the situation. So as an artist, do you feel that you also have this additional responsibility in this regard to be talking about it?
Yeah, I do, and there were several incidents where several activist groups wanted me to be a spokesperson for for various movements, and I just find it that you can be responsible in your own realm and kind of do your own work, but only along those terms, in that art context. And once you're asked to be somebody else, then you kind of, whatever you do, it loses its potency. So it is something that obviously a lot of people that work with Middle Eastern politics have to juggle.
Maeve, in terms of your work, so you're not Lebanese by origin, but you've chosen to, most of your work is there now, and you have this very, very interesting family context. So Richmond, obviously, he's a great name for all of us who study this material, have done in the past. So for you, what really took you there? Did you go to Lebanon just on a visit, or how did you end up doing what you're doing now?
So I guess I kind of explored a little bit of that with them. So Anas, he's my great-grandfather, and then his kind of role in Jerusalem and his time there, he was there for 20 years. meant that his son also learned Arabic and became a diplomat. So my mother also grew up in Kuwait and Jordan. So there's this kind of like ongoing connection with that area. So those were the kind of conversations we would have when I was growing up, and obviously his kind of politics as a pro-Palestinian kind of governor in the British Mandate, and I think pretty much one of the only ones kind of, I guess, shaped the way I saw things. And I didn't intend to necessarily root my work around that, but I was doing some research for my dissertation and looking at A.L. Weizmann, this Israeli architectural theorist who looks at the way that Israel uses architecture to reinforce the occupation in Palestine. And I obviously connected that to Ernest's kind of interest in the politics of architecture and the potential in the political agency of the Dome of the Rock and its kind of survival as a building. So those things connected, and I got a grant to go to Palestine in 2013, and that was the initial kind of thing that led me there. And then it was actually by chance that I heard about this school, Ashkel Alwan, which is a really great kind of interdisciplinary course in Beirut. And I had wanted to carry on studying Arabic, and I ended up going there.
In terms of, in terms of what you've been doing, which is going and looking at these amazing monuments, which obviously it's Lebanon's heritage. I mean, there's something very touching about the man who's the guardian, and one hears this actually in Iraq a lot about these extraordinary people who just had been guarding these incredible sites for such a long time and feel a very personal connection to them. And so, is this a kind of work that you're planning to continue? Is this have we seen something which is the beginning of a story? Is there a part two to what we've been seeing?
I mean, I would hope to go back and meet with those people again. It was a really amazing experience working with them. I mean, it's obviously not my story, and I think that's kind of something that I try to address in the format of the work. And I was led there through a kind of personal history, but obviously I didn't feel like comfortable producing a work in Lebanon without really spending a lot of time there. So it was after being there for 3 years that I began the research into that film, and then the form of the work is really very much based around the stories of the people that I find, and I try not to have too much of a presence, though people are made aware that I'm there, and often the films take the form of a kind of tour of these sites. So it is kind of with reference to the fact that I know that the viewer will often not be from there as well, so it's a kind of similar kind of experience for them.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And so Tamara, I mean, I think I was linking the two because of this amazing Fakhri who's called, and as I just said, we did hear these kind of heroic stories of these amazing people who've been looking after these places. And so I was very struck. Obviously, what you're doing with the Ruya Foundation is truly visually and extraordinary, and I was very struck this time. It seemed to be a new departure, really, to bring the antiquities there. It made it incredibly moving. So for those of you who haven't seen it, the first part of Tamara showed it in the slides, but the first part of it was a low showcase with these tiny little objects, and they were figurines and all sorts of extraordinary things. And one of the very moving things for me was in talking to Sadiq was because Sadiq, like so many Iraqi artists, just spent a lot of his youth actually in the National Museum and drawing all these objects. And he said to me that when he came into the pavilion, he absolutely fell apart and started weeping.
He broke down.
Because for him there was something.
Well, also because I think he was telling us that the last time he had seen those pieces from the museum was when he was a student. So it went back to the 80s, and I think it's again kind of trying to address this point, which I think we've all tried in different ways, which is loss and reparation, or rather repair and reparation, which is something that also, like another more how can I put it? I mean,
it's a subject which it has very different forms to it, and I think one of the points of this conceiving of this specific exhibition entitled Archaic is especially to address or to engage with contemporary artists today. And I suppose we are, in a way, it's not about being, ahead or behind, but we're kind of in the story, maybe one step, kind of slightly a bit more, have had more time than, let's say, the Syrian diaspora and what's going on in Syria today, which is very raw, very painful, all the various things that we see. But the fact that, for example, in dealing with artists from Iraq, you're dealing with a very different lexicon of meanings, both visually, culturally, educationally, versus, let's say, artists who are Iraqi who live in the diaspora. I mean, it's a very different story, and I think we as a foundation have been trying to address those things in many different ways, including a database that is live and active. But it's also, we see the other side of it, having realized some of these things. It's a huge, huge challenge. And even when you provide platforms for people, or at least, I mean, I would like to say they're humble because I think there's a lot more potential. It's very hard to get people to communicate. And so one reason why it seemed really important to be able to bring together in a space, both for the let's say, Iraqi sense of identity, but also internationally in a pavilion, a national pavilion, which by definition I think is increasingly dubious, but in an important biennale like Venice, is to be able to create those links where you see that very materiality of the objects that you talked about, that you found so moving. I mean, the reasons that those specific objects were selected were aesthetically, yes, I mean, I'm not an archaeologist, but yes, I mean, it was great to have things that were Neolithic and also were Old Babylonian and Sasanian. But at the same time, there's a kind of a materiality. It shows you a life, like they're vehicles to documenting existence that is not just about symbols of power. So, for example, one of the, I don't have it to show you, I have it in the book, but there's a baby rattle, which was picked for the theme of music, which is Neolithic. And I mean, it's just, it's a tiny thing that you carry in your hand, and it's survived. I mean, Neolithic means it's 8,000 years old, and it's, I think, incredibly moving because of the function of what it does, and because it records a life that one can relate to today, but equally to commission. Sorry, there were 9 artists in this exhibition, plus the artifacts. Of the 9, 2, Jawad Salim and Shakir Hassan, who were the founding fathers, arguably, of Iraqi modern art. I mean, starting from the 40s, are dead. So we had 6 living artists, of which we commissioned 5. The 6th was a photojournalist, and we used the work he did recently on Mosul. But so it was really interesting to commission 5 artists to work on themes that connect to antiquity, although not necessarily. It's a loose connection, but it's this kind of also weight of heritage, which can be empowering and also debilitating. And I think this applies to other places. I mean, arguably Greece, Italy. I mean, it's also a universal story.
Absolutely. No, it's really fascinating. And I've often wondered, when you go to Venice, like how, when you see a country pavilion, actually, how does one choose how to represent a country? And I remember I don't know if it was the last one, there was a Palestinian pavilion that had been created. So this whole relationship between these official and unofficial pavilions and all of that. I don't know, Larissa, were you involved in that in the last? There was a Palestine pavilion in Venice. No. Anyway, it's another conversation. But Zahrah, your work is you talked about your sources of inspiration, and you showed very beautiful houses, but you also showed a lot of places that were destroyed. So, in terms of the work that you're doing, are you're consciously drawing attention to both the beauty of those places and also their destruction? Is that what?
Actually, I have all my work. I focused in the dark aspect because a lot of artists in Saudi Arabia appear the decorative and the design of this architecture. And when I am starting to speak about the traditional, my home, I did same copy the style of this decoration. But I didn't find Zahrah in this work, okay? I maybe spent 2 years in my studio to find inside my emotional and to find the relation between me and my home. All my year, the holiday, go in southwestern Saudi Arabia, and I find this home like cry and need help. All my work under my emotional and my emotional, when I am in my studio, this like appear, yeah, and all my works independent in what I want to say. All my work, no, like imagination, this facts from facts, and speaking about the story in traditional architecture in southwestern Saudi Arabia, and the material. When I am choose the material, maybe 3,000 experiments for leather, paper, and carton boxes, but the sand, I find myself in the sand. Maybe this related to cultural and the region, and then I am trying to connect between that's I have a subject, and I understand what I want to say through my work, but I want to move this situation of tradition to contemporary art. In this area, I am focused in the Western artists and made like connect between me and the Western artist, and then go.
So you didn't find your voice?
Yes.
But now you have, your voice is there. I mean, as I understand it, the installation that you did upstairs in the British Museum, this is the first one that you've done actually live. Is that right?
The first time.
The first time, because the other ones you've done them in the gallery before. So what did that feel like?
In the first time, I was very worried and fair and shy from the people, but maybe 10 minutes. And then I forget everything.
That's wonderful. I just wanted, just before turning it over to everybody, there's something in your film, Larissa, that really struck me in the film, and I wish we'd been able to see a bit more. The question: why did you make archaeology your front line? Archaeology can be instrumentalized, and I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about that, because that's such a powerful thing that was said in that film.
I realized that I haven't been able to really elaborate on this because I ran out of time. Didn't manage my time well. But yeah, the film is very much focused on archaeology and how it's instrumentalized, specifically more than anywhere in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, I don't know if people know, but it's headline news in Israeli newspapers. So the idea of kind of trying to prove your the right or to belong to that land is very much related to archaeological finds. So yeah, I think Israel has, from its inception, been trying very hard to prove that they really have they have the right to belong to the land. So I wanted to have this twist for Palestinians that now really it is Palestinians are about to be erased from the face of that land, and the fact that using Israeli kind of tactics of trying to use archaeology for that end is quite interesting, because you're kind of using, and I find that Israel always tries to plant facts on the ground, and I thought it would be interesting to plant facts in the ground. So it's kind of, I mean, we tried, I think throughout the history of Palestine there were different movements of resistance, and this is just kind of another way of trying to find a different way of talking about this subject. So I did go and plant different porcelain with, and I wanted to date it, to have carbon dated. And apparently it's being done now in archaeology. I was told by archaeologists, for future archaeologists to find. So it's an attempt that, if not in our time, then maybe in the future, Palestinians would be recognized, you know, as a people who, you know, roamed the land.
An amazing idea. Now, do we have some time for a few questions? Can I see any hands up there? Yes, Louisa.
I have a question about. Oh, sorry. I have a question. I suppose specifically for Zahrah and Larissa, about the actual fabric of earth and how it corresponds to, you know, ownership of land and territory. And I remember Zahrah told me once in Dubai that this idea that the earth is like the skin of your mother, and I just thought that was quite an interesting parallel.
Actually, when I am start to use the fabric, first time I am try to find any material I can to catch with the sand for the put in the wall and for the hanging in the wall. After made many experiments in this fabric, I find like give me that touch like the sand, the earth. Here I think I am I like when I like I am تجربة ناجحة. لا تجربة ناجحة. Successful experiment. After that, I am continue with the fabric, with the plaster and glue and glue with the wood to give me the same touch of the earth.
I'm sorry, I actually did not understand your question very well, so if you could elaborate on it, please.
I suppose it's a different question really in the context of your work, but it was this idea of the fact that you were using ceramics and burying them in the earth, and the relationship between actually using earth as your raw material and the cultural claim over territory.
I think in my previous work I always kind of tried to stay away from that particular land. So I think there's a tug and pull always in my work between a belonging to that land and kind of, maybe it's quite interesting in the Palestinian experience how the diaspora is actually also in a way a belonging to that land. So it's very hard to understand the Palestinian experience without understanding, you know, the exodus of the Palestinian people. So I think in the most recent film is when I really finally do use that land. The way it's been used, I think, by Israel to kind of mimic that way of, you know, claiming your heritage. So I think that was a new kind of trajectory in my work. And I think I'll probably be working more on that note.
Actually, it's also a personal question. Are we, as an Arab artist or Middle Eastern, able to produce an artwork which go beyond our problems? Because all the time, what I'm seeing in all museums and all big institutions, without underestimating, of course, what we are doing, because I think it's very important to document and to work on it in a different way. Like personally, I deal with it in the same way. I was asking this question to myself all the time. I live in Germany, and seeing German fellows, or not only German, like international artists as well. You go to museum and you see work about, I don't know, personal problems, or I don't know, anything individual, completely individual, while all the time going to big institutions, and all the big names I know also from the airport, they represent only our problem. That's the first part of the question. The second part, are the institutions themselves, are they ready to show this work, or also only they fall into this trap where they see us only through our problems? You know, like if you produce anything about, I don't know, women rights, anything political, LGBT community, anything in the West from that part of the world will be well received here. Thanks.
Yes. So part one of your question, which I'm just going to repeat to remind myself, is whether you think that Arab artists or like art from the Middle East is only about conflict or what's going on today, in a very politicized way versus more personal work that could be, much more intimate, much more personal. My answer to that would be that I think it's absolutely necessary to have the whole range. I don't think the work from the Middle East should be just about war and X, Y, Z, W. It's also about love, about gender, about music, about sex, about so many things. But it leads into the second issue, which I think has to do with, was touched upon, which is something very problematic to do with, at least what I've experienced working specifically in the Iraqi story, is self-censorship. And the understanding of what it is to be an artist is a very different thing for very different people, and for many different artists. I mean, you have a whole, and one can go back and talk about, education and access to education, and who, art education and culture, who has access and how they have that access. I mean, probably if you speak a foreign language, you have better access than if you only speak Arabic, because of what there is in terms of reading, of consuming stuff. Versus, for example, people who relate to, and this is, I think, it's a similar story in Syria. I imagine it is, where you have a whole generation or two of artists that understand art as purely decorative. So it's just about, which is not necessarily wrong. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it's just about basically how you match colors together in an abstract, and it's oil. And at some point, that inability to reinvent yourself or research or explore and continuously reproduce the same thing can be also very deadening. I mean, it's kind of, there's an element of like a loss of hope but like transitioning to the second part of the question, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think it's really, really important that all aspects are represented. And I think when one talks about, I'm very curious about the idea of art in conflict. And when I mean conflict, I don't just mean the Middle East, and I don't just mean war. I mean, it could be, what's going on with the wall in Mexico. It could be the situation. And there's a lot of different notions of conflict that are not just about war and displacement the way that we see them. But in all of that, I think it's really important to be able to endorse and support platforms and artists to communicate whatever they have to communicate. To protect that, as opposed to just produce work that reconfirms the stereotype and the notion of how the other sees us. I think we are also responsible. It's a two-way story, but.
Yeah, it's a question that always comes up whenever you're on a Middle Eastern panel. But I think it's kind of impossible to think that you can make great work that is worth listening to if it's not really relevant to the context that you're in. So it's better to embrace that moment that we're in this I think, exciting moment in Middle Eastern art that is interesting to follow that through and see where that takes us. I feel that if you remember First World War and how it affected European art, it's quite amazing. And if you then spoke to the Russian constructivists and told them, why don't you make work that's not about Russian constructivism? Well, there were people who were working like that, but they were not relevant at that moment. So I think it's quite exciting. I think it's important not to constantly beat ourselves as to why we're doing this and what we're representing, if actually what we're doing is something that we're happy with. So, yeah.
I think probably we should, I think we're coming to an end, aren't we? So unless there's one, is there one more burning question? No, anyway, well, I'd ask you to join me in thanking our wonderful panel. I'm going to hand over to Eckhart now. You can go there or here.
Thank you very much. I'm Eckhart Thiemann. I'm the artistic director of the Shabak Festival. And it's really for me just to provide the concluding remarks of this really fascinating event today, the survival of the artist. It takes a long time to produce and think through a festival like ours, and the first discussion we've had about this seminar was probably about 1.5 years ago. And it was two crucial discussions that led to today's event. One was here in the British Museum with Venetia Porter. It was just at the time when we saw two things happening at the same time. Destruction, Palmyra, Iraq, stories were coming out, and also the first technologies that looked at 3D printing and new ways of replicas, and a massive migration, mainly from Syria, the dispersal of people. And we ask ourselves how a museum that is this wonderful receptacle to protect objects and material culture, what responsibilities, what roles it would have also to people, and what the link is between the material culture, let's say the fate of objects and the fate of people. And very soon after, the discussion with Shireen Atassi in Dubai brought the same problematic out, a foundation that has the wonderful but also difficult responsibility to look after a fantastic collection of material culture, a collection of Syrian art, at the same time recognize that somehow it had a responsibility to the artists that were dispersed, and how could they, as a foundation, kind of combine the two. So it sort of stuck in our mind that there was some missing tissue about how we speak about preservation of the fate of objects and the fate of people. And that's something we wanted to unpick a little bit or discuss further at one event in Shabak. And I'm really, really pleased that many then came on board on our journey, the Atassi Foundation, Mawad Al-Thaqafi, and Mosaic Rooms, who were really our first address to go to after the phenomenally successful conference in the last Shabak festival, The Disappearing Cities of the Arab World. I'm delighted with today's conference. I thought we had some really, really interesting ideas. I'm not going to try to summarize or conclude them because this is really the starting point. What stayed with me, and maybe I should just spend 1 minute on this, is we also saw the world premiere of a new work, and this was for the absent ones. So this is a piece we were pleased to commission. So really you were today the first ones to witness this. We're going to show it twice more in Shabak next week at the Arcola Theatre in a theatre space as part of a double bill. But this piece was developed through deep research, 4 artists, one Tunisian, one Syrian now based in Lebanon, and 2 English, really trying to make research what migration does to people, not just to artists, but to people generally at the moment. It created a new work in collaboration. It was 4 artists involved. It created a new work and it needed people to travel to come here and present it. So I think what is really important that came out in many of the discussion points today is the right for artists to research, to go deep into material of the issues that matter for them to collaborate with whoever they want to collaborate with, to keep creating new work, and not to be barred by visas or any other issues to come together to present their work. So this work, I think, really encapsulated a lot of the values that I think we need to hold on to and fight for and persevere. I think the other thing that struck me about this work is it had 100% reality in it. It was about this world right now, right here. And it had 100% imagination in this. It was a theater piece. It took us somewhere else. It was a voice through headphones. And I think that balance between imagination and rooted in today's world gave it its strength. And it's something we discussed throughout the day. So to finish, really just to thank you very, very much for coming, to thank all our collaborators, particularly to Faisal Tamar and Salih Ali Reza, who made Zahrah al-Ghamdi's presence here possible, both for the installation as well as for her to speak here. Shabak is carrying on for another 14 days, I think, until the 16th of July. You have the brochure. I hope to see you at future events. Thank you very much for coming.